1912. That is the year the ice first showed us what it was capable of. Robert Falcon Scott and 4 companions reached the South Pole on the 17th of January, only to find a Norwegian flag already planted there. They turned back. They walked. And then, one by one, they stopped walking forever. I accepted that story. I was taught it as a lesson in human endurance, in the cruelty of nature, in the cost of ambition. I didn't question it. It fit cleanly into the narrative we have been given about Antarctica, that it is simply hostile, simply cold, simply indifferent to human life. Then I started looking at the medical logs more carefully, and once I did, I couldn't stop. The official record on Antarctica is extraordinarily consistent. It tells us the continent was discovered in 1820, that its early explorers died of exposure and scurvy and starvation, that the 1959 Antarctic Treaty was a rare and beautiful moment of Cold War cooperation, 12 nations setting aside their nuclear anxieties to dedicate an entire continent to peaceful science. That is the foundation. That is what we are given. And taken individually, each piece of that story is defensible. Taken together, across a span of a century and a half, the story begins to develop a very specific kind of pressure. Because here is what the official record does not linger on. It does not linger on the fact that 3 separate nations independently claimed to discover the same continent within months of each other in 1820. Not years, months, as though they were each following the same set of directions to the same address. It does not linger on the cartographic anomaly I examined in the previous investigation, the Peary Rise map of 1513, which renders the Antarctic coastline with a subglacial accuracy that our civilization would not technically achieve for another 442 years. And it does not linger on what was found in the ice cores. I want to be precise about what I am not saying. I am not saying Antarctica is a burial ground. I am not yet saying anything definitive at all. What I am saying is this. When you place the timeline of human contact with this continent against the timeline of how aggressively, how permanently, and how quietly the world's most powerful governments move to control it, a pattern emerges that exposure and scurvy do not explain. Hold that, we are only at the beginning. Scott's journal ends on the 29th of March, 1912. That final entry is famous. It has been quoted in classrooms and eulogies for over a century. What is discussed far less often is what the journal does not contain, specifically, the entries that should exist between the 14th and 22nd of March, a 9-day window during which the expedition's physician, Edward Wilson, appears to have maintained his own separate medical log. That log has never been published in full. What has been released exists only in heavily excerpted form, filtered through the editorial decisions of the expedition survivors and sponsors. I want to be careful here. Missing documents are not by themselves evidence of anything. Archives are incomplete, paper decays, institutions lose things, I understand that. But the physical record of what happened to these men is harder to explain away. The official cause of death for Scott and his companions is hypothermia and starvation, and that is almost certainly true as far as it goes. What the official account handles more delicately are the specific symptoms recorded in Wilson's partial notes and in the expedition's base camp diary. The unusual bruising on Edgar Evans before his death, the joint degradation that moved too quickly for standard frostbite, and most specifically, the neurological disorientation described in Evans's final days that the expedition initially attributed to a head injury sustained weeks earlier. Standard exposure does not produce that particular cluster. Scurvy does not produce that particular cluster. Something produced it. Remember that cluster, it will return. Edgar Evans was the first to die, on the 17th of February. He was 35 years old. He was the strongest man on the team. He was the first to show these symptoms. And the men who found their bodies 8 months later noted something in their report that was quietly removed from the popular account. that the physiological deterioration of at least one corpse was inconsistent with the timeline of death as officially recorded. That is not my interpretation. That is in the recovery report. The question I keep returning to is this. If these men died exactly where and how the record says they died, why does the physical evidence require so much editorial management? And if the answer is simply sensitivity, protecting the dignity of the dead, then why does that same editorial instinct appear 35 years later in a completely different context, on a completely different class of men, at a completely different scale? That is where we are going next. Operation Highjump's official casualty count is 3. 3 men, in a force of 4,700, across 13 ships, over 8 weeks of active operations in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The Navy attributes those 3 deaths to an aircraft crash on the 4th of January, 1947, a PBM Mariner seaplane that went down during a scouting mission. That explanation is on record. I am not disputing it. What I am raising is the arithmetic. Let me say that slowly. 4,700 men, 8 weeks, 3 deaths. In Antarctica, that casualty rate is not just low, it is statistically anomalous for a military operation of that scale in that environment. Standard naval operations in temperate waters during peacetime produce higher incidental mortality. Cold weather expeditions of a fraction of this size have historically produced far higher losses. The official number suggests that the most logistically ambitious polar operation in human history unfolded with near-perfect medical outcomes right up until the moment the entire fleet turned around and fled. I don't know what the real number is. I want to be honest about that. What I do know is that the medical debriefs of returning crew members were classified at a level inconsistent with a weather-related retreat, and that at least 2 naval historians researching Highjump in the 1980s independently reported being denied access to the fleet's surgical logs on national security grounds. Not privacy grounds. National security grounds. Hold that distinction. The symptoms described in the fragmentary accounts that have surfaced through crew memoirs, through Chilean naval observers who were present, through a single journalist who filed a report that was pulled before publication, suggests something closer to the cluster we examined in Wilson's partial notes from 1912. Rapid bruising, neurological symptoms, deterioration that moved faster than the cold alone would produce. 35 years apart, 2 entirely separate operations, the same category of symptom, managed with the same category of silence. But here is what changes everything about the picture. Because the casualties, whatever their true number, are not actually the strangest part of what happened after Highjump ended. The strangest part is what the world's governments did next, and how fast they did it. The Antarctic Treaty was signed on the 1st of December, 1959. 12 nations ratified it. The United States and the Soviet Union signed the same document, in the same room, without significant dispute, at the precise midpoint of the Cold War, 2 years after Sputnik, 3 years before the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the same calendar decade in which both nations were actively designing nuclear weapons intended to destroy each other's cities. I want you to sit with that for a moment. These 2 governments could not agree on the governance of Berlin. They could not agree on the status of Korea. They maintained a state of nuclear hair-trigger hostility that would persist for another 30 years. And yet, when it came to Antarctica, a continent that officially contains nothing of strategic or economic value, they moved with a speed and unanimity that their diplomats had never managed on any other subject. The treaty negotiations took 18 months. Most bilateral arms discussions of that era took decades. If you are finding this investigation useful, consider subscribing. The more of us who document these anomalies in detail, the harder they become to dismiss. Now, back to the treaty, because the language itself is where this becomes impossible to ignore. The treaty does not simply demilitarize Antarctica. It prohibits nuclear testing, yes, but it also establishes a sweeping inspection regime, grants signatory nations the right to monitor each other's activities, and contains an Article VII provision allowing for aerial surveillance of the entire continent at any time. This is not the architecture of a peace agreement. This is the architecture of a shared monitoring protocol. The language is not, "We agree to leave this place alone." The language is, "We agree to watch this place together." 12 nations, bitter rivals, all accepting the same restrictions, all accepting the same oversight, all agreeing simultaneously and without public explanation that this particular landmass required a category of international governance that no other place on Earth has ever received. What were they all afraid of finding there, or afraid of someone else finding first? The answer, I think, is in what they are doing there right now. Lake Vostok sits approximately 4 kilometers beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet. It is roughly the size of Lake Ontario. It has been sealed under that ice for somewhere between 15 and 25 million years, isolated from the surface atmosphere, from sunlight, from any biological exchange with the outside world. In 2012, a Russian drilling team reached it, the culmination of decades of work, the deepest ice penetration ever achieved. The official scientific framing was straightforward. This was an opportunity to study ancient, isolated microbial life, a remarkable achievement, a triumph of persistence. I don't dispute that framing. What I want to draw your attention to is the protocol surrounding it. The containment procedures required to drill into Vostok were not standard scientific precautions. They were, in the precise technical language of the project documentation, biosafety containment measures designed to prevent surface biological material from entering the lake, but equally, to prevent lake material from reaching the surface uncontrolled. The drilling fluid itself was subject to quarantine-level handling requirements. The core samples were transported in sealed, pressurized containers. The scientists on-site operated under medical monitoring protocols that continued for weeks after their return. Let me be precise about what I am not saying. These are responsible scientific practices for working with unknown ancient biology. I understand that. What I am saying is that the precaution level matches a known threat profile, and it matches it very specifically. Because the symptom cluster the scientists were screening for upon return, the bloodwork panels, the neurological assessments, was not generic. It was the same category of screening applied to the high-jump crew members whose medical files we cannot access. Someone already knew what to look for. Here is what this investigation actually shows, stripped of every detail and reduced to its architecture. 5 men die on the ice in 1912, and the physician's log describing their final symptoms is never released in full. 35 years later, the most powerful military force ever assembled in the Southern Hemisphere retreats in 8 weeks, and its medical records are sealed under national security classification. 12 years after that, nuclear adversaries cooperate on a continental lockdown in 18 months. 65 years after high jump, scientists drilling into a sealed subglacial lake deploy the precise screening protocol that matches the classified debrief criteria of the men who fled. The missing log pages, the arithmetic of 3 casualties, the 18 months, the matching protocol, the ice that is measurably thinner today than it was when Scott's men walked onto it. I want to be honest about what I don't have. I don't have the classified files. I don't have a pathogen name or a confirmed casualty number or a document that uses the word quarantine in the context of the 1959 treaty. I'm not offering you certainty. What I am offering is the shape of the silence, because the silence has a shape, and it is consistent across 113 years and at least 4 separate institutions that should have no knowledge of each other's findings. The central question, the one I have been sitting with for months and cannot resolve, is this: did the world's governments seal Antarctica to keep us out or to keep something in? If this series has been worth something to you, leave your theories below. I read them. They have more than once changed where I looked next. The next investigation goes somewhere I wasn't sure I was prepared to go. It begins with a single entry in a Norwegian whaling log from 1892, 20 years before Scott, written by a man who turned his ship around after one day in Antarctic waters and never publicly explained why. I think I am ready now. The ice is still there. It is just not as thick as it used to be.